Welcome to this first teaching and learning briefing, which is going to look at the art of explanation. The most exciting aspect for those of us who are now preparing online lessons for remote learning is that we now have the best opportunity to consider the quality of the explanations that we're actually giving. I know that just from speaking to colleagues, that teachers are worrying that students who are given work to digest remotely may not actually understand as well as they would if they were in the classroom. Perhaps this is because the content is felt that it's not presented as well. Well, I would question why not. In actual fact, the same quality learning principles apply online as they do in the classroom. And by being exposed to these challenges of online learning, we have to really reflect on our teaching practice. In other words, what I'm trying to say simply here is that the skills that we're going to look at here in this teaching and learning briefing today for making online explanations clear and concise apply just as much in the classroom and when we return to formal learning environments. So just to move forward, we're going to look at Exposition. This is a part 1 briefing, and the focus today is on tethering. Some of you may know and have come across the word tethering before. We're not talking about mobile phone tethering here, which is a transfer of information, but we're looking at the ability to build new knowledge on previous knowledge, so sort of conceptual development knowledge where students are learning new things by connecting them, making links to prior knowledge that they already have. In the book by Willingham there, Why Don't Students Like School? Great quote where he says, "We understand new things in the context of what we already know, and what we already know is concrete." So the suggestion that we have concrete knowledge, things that we know that are tangible, that are fact-based, and by tapping into those existing knowledge base, we can build new things. And that is what tethering is. There's 3 aspects of tethering that we're going to look at in this session: analogy, inference, and concrete bridging. So just to begin with analogy. Analogy, we're introducing an unfamiliar idea, something that students haven't been exposed to before, but by comparing it to something that is similar, that they already know about, so they can see the comparison and work out the difference. So let's imagine, for some examples here, that I'm teaching and I've got the objective of explaining how the Earth's changing orbit affects climate. And probably here the students understand climate, they know the Earth, they may even know orbit, they may not, but can they visualize, can they really construct in their head a mental representation of the orbit changing and the climate changing as a result of that? What I could do is just give them the information on paper, on PowerPoint, read it out and present as follows. The Earth's orbit changes shape every 100,000 years. When we are in an elliptical orbit, we are further away from the sun and therefore we are colder. When we are in a circular orbit, we are closer to the sun and therefore warmer. Now, I could teach that as a reading paragraph, I could unpick it, I could ask what elliptical means and orbit, circular and so forth, but I'm not confident that I would ensure that all the students have a clear sort of mental representation of what I'm trying to explain. So I'd class that as a non-example, how I wouldn't want to deliver that information. I'm sticking with analogy. How would I use analogy? I could just present diagrams of what is happening. Now we know that using multimodalities, so different ways of presenting information, pictures, text, audio, video, etc. is really powerful. And yes, giving a diagram such as this with the sun in the middle and the 2 orbits around it kind of gives some clarity on there's a change in orbit around the sun. But is this process fully understood? We're not quite there yet. I want to compare it to something the students may already know very well. In this case, when teaching this particular topic, I know that students have already learned in science that electrons are circling the proton and neutron in an atom. So by giving this sort of analogy, this comparison, the students are understanding there that there is this orbit around the sun. There is this movement around. The sun is in the center, like the nucleus of the atom, and the Earth is going around it like the electrons. And the language we sort of use when using an analogy is up there in red. It's like where we say, oh, it's just like when, it's similar to, think of when, and you're comparing. It's a bit of a comparison technique to what the students already know to something new. And then, with this knowledge that the Earth is going around the sun, I can then unpick this diagram on the right where I'm sort of looking at the different shapes. When is it closer? When is it further away? If we're closer, would we be warmer? If we're further away, would we be colder? These sorts of questions can unpick that a bit better. But using analogy is going to build much stronger conceptual understanding than just giving that text straight away that we can't guarantee that 100% of our students would pick up. So that's analogy. That's the first sort of tethering technique. Moving on then to inference. And inference is where you're getting the students to draw conclusions on something new, work out, infer something new, based on the skill that they've done this somewhere else before. So they've come to a conclusion and worked out something somewhere before. So with that same sort of thought process, how might they apply that to a new setting? So I'm going to look at an example here. The objective to explain why the River Thames needs a barrier. Great, got a photograph of the Thames barrier and the river there. I'm sure that if I did a think, pair, share or a class discussion on why is that barrier needed, we would get some good answers. They might talk about things like, oh, it's to stop some flooding. We probably would get it to stop flooding. That may be a good answer, and that would be a right answer. But I haven't used inference to gain the sort of powerful answer that I really want from this. So let me show you how this could go. Knowing that students have studied climate change, they've studied Bangladesh, I might refer them back to an image of houses being built along rivers in Bangladesh, being built on stilts, and say to them, can you remember why people were building houses on stilts along the rivers in Bangladesh? And the students will be thinking about what was it we learned about those rivers. And it's not just that they're flooding. They'll think back to, oh, do you know what? We learned about thermal expansion, where water is heated and it gets warmer and it rises. We learned about how the glaciers are melting, rising the river levels and the ocean's levels and so forth. And the houses being flooded and need to be on stilts. So giving that example and then working out how they got to that answer, when I now present them with this and then they say, okay, why does the River Thames need a barrier? And I've got an image there on the right now of the property around it as well. And they'll probably infer some more answer rather than saying to prevent London from flooding. They may now use what they remember from the Bangladesh lesson to sort of say that, well, maybe the River Thames is rising and at risk of flooding because of climate change, because of thermal expansion raking the water ice, because of glaciers melting, land ice melting, which is making that. So you're getting a much sort of stronger answer possibly coming from the students. They've gone through the process of working it out and they can connect it. There's a synoptic link there back to other knowledge there. But that inferring, getting them to really work it out, gives a better understanding of where we're trying to go with the barrier. And now my lesson might go on and look at the value of the property and so forth here. The final strategy we're going to look at is bridging. Bridging concrete examples, things we know, to new context. So using the bridging as an example of a strategy, my lesson objective here is how do financial loans exploit developing countries? Now, in this question for my students, developing countries is some knowledge that they'll probably have. They'll understand that they're poorer countries. It's very easy to explain what a loan is, giving some money and you get something back. They're kind of the easy parts. This word exploit, it's one of these sort of tier 2 vocabulary words that we can't guarantee students know. And it's sometimes difficult, and they get thrown in exams when they looked at these questions in assessments. They get thrown and they might often go thinking it means something else, a consequence or cause or some other sort of vocabulary. What I could do, which I'm going to say is a non-example, is just define the word. Now, nothing wrong with giving definitions, that's absolutely fine. However, if I'm defining exploitation as when something is done unfairly for others to benefit, do they really understand what that means? How can I connect that to some understanding they already have? So I might talk about sweatshops or factories or manufacturing industry in developing countries we've looked at before. I've got an image here in Foxconn, a Chinese franchise company which are making electronic products for companies such as Apple. My example here is workers are paid unfairly to allow large companies to profit, and telling them this is an example of exploitation, that the worker there is paid unfairly, not good enough, not well enough, not high enough salary indeed, in order that companies like Apple, for example, can make money and profit. This is exploitation. Students are beginning to get an understanding possibly of what exploitation means, but we're maybe not 100% yet. I've got a rainforest. We maybe studied rainforests last year, and I'm saying here that animals and tribes lose their homes unfairly as loggers, those who chop the wood, deforest, make money from selling this. And I've got this concept of unfair making money. This is exploitation. So now when referring to this question, how do financial loans exploit developing countries? I want the students to pick that apart with the understanding of exploitation and what that word means. So I might do a think, pair, share, some sort of turn and talk now over to students, looking at that question, getting them to think who is being treated unfairly. That would be the developing countries, probably they would work that out. Who do you think will profit? Possibly developed countries or whoever's given them this loan. And they've got this idea of exploitation. When I move on and use exploitation in another setting, or they come into another context in another lesson with that word exploitation, they're more likely to be able to connect back to this idea of unfair treatment and someone else benefiting from that. So I've linked, as in all three of these techniques, I've linked previous knowledge to help them develop new knowledge. And this is a technique called tethering. If you'd like to see more information on tethering, do have a look at Memorable Teaching, the book there on the slide, some references to that and other techniques for helping exposition. Hope this has been really helpful.